Everybody, thank you very much for staying with us. As you can see from the title of the session, we are going to talk a little bit about the breakdown of trust, or at least a perceived breakdown of trust. I know the conversation that we had just in the green room, I think it's fair to say it's a reasonably accurate statement that there is an element of, a lot of grey and a lot of black boxes out there. Before we get going properly, perhaps if you could all just introduce yourselves, who you're from. I know we can see up here, but just a little bit about what you do within your organizations. And maybe just if you could give us your opinions, just very briefly, on the breakdown of trust. Is it that bad? You know, what is driving it? So, Will, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, of course. I'm Will King. I am the commercial director for the Media Trust. So if you don't know what we are, I guess, we help identify and resolve issues in the digital ecosystem. For our customers, those issues are generally security, malware related, ad quality and data compliance. Mm-hmm. We do this for publishers and we do this for ad tech platforms and increasingly for sort of enterprise type retail businesses as well.
All right. Well, how bad is the trust issue? Is this overblown?
So I guess we have a slightly different perspective than exclusively trust. One of the observations that we make in our business is that there are a whole bunch of companies doing business with each other who don't know who each other are.
Okay.
And so rather than perhaps there being a lack of trust, there is certainly a lack of transparency, and that transparency is as to who is there, what are they doing, how do they get there, how do I communicate with them, what are the net outcomes of working or not working with them.
Okay, great. Jana, do you want to take
Sure.
us from there as a publisher?
Yes, I'm Jana Maron. I'm the SVP of Programmatic and Data Strategy at Insider Inc., formerly known as Business Insider. I think that the trust and transparency issue is really bad because we all don't know what we don't know, and we don't find out until after something really bad happens, and there's a consequence that we as an industry pay, and that's when the trust starts to break down, and we continuously overcomplicate things so that we're continuously creating situations where nobody understands, and so therefore nobody trusts each other.
Okay.
I trust you, Jana.
Trust you too, Jay.
I'm Jay Friedman, president of Goodway Group. Goodway Group, we are a 90-year-old company that...
You look so young.
I know. But, so we're a 90-year-old company, which puts us in the fact that we have no investors, no debt. We're fully independent, privately owned, and not looking to be acquired. And so, but from that perspective, it puts us in a unique position to kind of serve as a trust bellwether of the market from that perspective. And is trust an issue or is transparency an issue? Yeah, I think if you ask any brand, it's one of their top three, if not their top, concerns and frustrations. Mm-hmm. And it's a mess because my guess is that 80% of brands are very concerned, that what they're paying their agency may or may not be what they agreed to, and we're in a very good position to solve that.
Okay, well, if you listen to Sir Martin's session earlier on today, he said every advertiser was looking at in-housing. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, there were a lot of things that Sir Martin said that made me want to hire him as one of our sales representatives. He was very...
You're out there, Sir Martin.
Well, I was going to email him, but I know that he's very busy with many things. So I think in-housing, in our view, there's about 9 levels of in-housing, and I think that every marketer wants to at least be on rung 1, but I think that it's this many marketers want to be on rung 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and as it goes up. Very few marketers want to own the whole thing in-house. I think they just don't know that there are grades of in-housing.
Got you. Okay. Yeah. Great. Tanzil, could you take us from there?
Sure. So Tanzil Bakari, I'm the MD for EMEA at DoubleVerify. Relatively new to the business. I've been here 2.5, 3 months. So getting up to speed with the verification space. So for those of you who don't know DV, we're focused on driving transparency, viewability, fraud-free environments, and trying to make sure that generally any and every impression is as quality and as high value as possible. And when we come to transparency, I think what generally gets the headlines is transparency in terms of the process of buying media, and it's a case of, well, I mean, what are the different components of that transaction, what value do they add, and so forth. I think our approach is, whilst that's important, we also need to make sure that throughout that environment, people are taking responsibility for ensuring better quality. And then secondly, it's about making sure that when you're wanting to buy media or you're wanting to sell media, that there's a true value associated with that. Mm-hmm. And I think that concept of value is something that leads to a lot of issues with transparency and trust.
Okay, all right. Well, so as we can all see, that there are some issues out there. What do you see as driving it? I know in one of our preparation calls, Johnny, you highlighted something that was quite interesting, which I found quite surprising, was how header bidding, which I think a lot of people in the independent ad tech space would have said that was quite a good thing. It's emerged in recent years. But you were saying how it may actually have had some repercussions that may not have been quite good in the industry, i.e. there was a lot of inventory and bids out there that really weren't adding a lot of values to media plans.
Yeah, so, yes, I said that. But,
Pep call.
yeah. The thing is that, right, when there was the traditional waterfall before header bidding came out, right, it went from one to the other, and I said to Michael Rubenstein earlier today, I was like, in those days, everybody was calling me to say, you need to put my bidder at the top of your stack. And with header bidding, now everything went to the browser, and there was this proliferation of supply, but not all of that supply was real, even, let's say, from the publisher, right? There are times where we make ad calls for inventory that is not going to serve because we make an ad call and every single time an ad loads, regardless of whether or not it's going to be direct or programmatic. And so it then therefore created this commoditization, and so all of the SSPs had to find some way to create unique value so that they could stay on page and all of that. And so, there were tricks and tools and various things that came out in the market that created this mistrust among the players.
Okay, so feel free, everybody else, to chime in with that, but I'd be quite interested to follow up. What were some of the tricks that you saw?
Oh, come on, man.
What? It's like proper insight from experts like yourself.
Well, I mean, think about when, Jay and I first met at a conference a few years ago, and he came up to me and he was like, I don't want to buy your inventory anymore on a private marketplace. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I have great inventory, I have quality users. And he was like, yeah, I'm getting it much cheaper on the open. And when we tried to do the match, we couldn't originally.
Yeah, it had us spending something like $5,000 on Insider, and she found like $212 had come through.
Okay.
And so this is exactly the problem that other folks are trying to solve, but this is clearly, so that's one element of trust. That marketers they're not getting what they think they're getting, and it's mislabeled. And 4 years ago, I think this was not solved, and this was very early on, and we've since mostly solved this. But then it also extends into just how marketers are paying their agencies, and I know we'll probably go there in a minute, but not to overstep.
Sure.
Just to add on to that, I think where we've seen a lot of challenge, and probably the most obvious place is exactly this, right? It's at that domain level. You're expected to buy Insider Inc. You don't end up there because they don't see the revenue, right? So there's how do we understand and how do we resolve that transparency issue? But then there's layers within there, right? There's, Insider Inc. have multiple categories, multiple different types of content, and if you tarnish everybody with that sort of those broad strokes with the large brush, you end up minimizing the value that someone like an insider could add, even though the expectation from the brand is that they're getting it. So there's, I think there's a lot of transparency issues that we need to surface at some point.
Sure. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Will, given what you see at the Media Trust or other places that you've worked.
I wouldn't want to get too trapped in auction mechanics specifically. I would say from the seat that we have in the market, one of the knock-on effects certainly for our publishing partners is that header access that is vital for known advertisers like yourselves to come into publishers has had some benefit in terms of the way it unifies an auction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Duplication of inventory and the opening of those doors also is a green flag for the types of advertising that we spend a lot of time trying to face down. Right, so I bet if you sampled publishers in the audience today, most of their ad quality issues will be driven out of header or EBDA, because you not only do you lose, you certainly lose that ability to audit as thoroughly as you would like to. Right? So in terms of identifying who is playing in that header, of course, the good people on this panel should be there. There are a bunch of other people that are harder to find. When you open up inventory in the way that the header can do, that transparency in terms of who's buying and who's connecting with my users becomes a real challenge.
Well, and on top of that, right, we made the assumption that we all knew how to look at an ad log, and that we had data scientists and we had all of these technologists who could do all of this for us. And so, this great big, everything's transparent. Here, I'm going to give you all of this information. Good luck. That also creates a trust issue, because yes, you're out for the publisher, but are you really? Because you're making it more difficult for me to understand what's happening under my own hood. Besides the fact that I have to pay for it.
Okay. All right. Jay, when we were talking earlier in the green room, you mentioned that there's two parts of the whole trust and the transparency conversation. You mentioned it was the financial dynamics and also what you're buying. Which do you see as more of an issue? And what kind of safeguards or measures are you putting in place to try and improve the situation?
Yeah, and there's really a third, as someone else was pointing out, which was the user, right? So there's user trust, there's what you're buying trust, and there's the financial transparency trust. And I think that for this industry, for this audience, I think that what you're buying and what you're paying is probably a little bit more relevant. I think we've spent 4 hours today on the consumer portion of it. But I think that it's really important to look at how marketers have just completely lost trust with, and not to pick on the holding companies, Sir Marty, whatever we call them now, did a fantastic job of that. But they are the targets, right? They're the biggest players in the space. And I think knowing where it came from, I think for so long, marketers, if you asked a marketer, like, hey, is your advertising really working? Would you bet money that your advertising is really working and you know it? They'd say, no. Right? Okay. Well, so what do you do when you don't know if something you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on isn't working? You focus on cost.
Yeah.
So they focused on cost, specifically with their agency model. So they created FTE models, and they created all these ways to choke cost out of the system, because cost was the only thing they absolutely could track. But what's happened is that we absolutely can tell whether your advertising's working now. And to someone's point this morning, yeah, it's a pain to cross-measure between Snap and Facebook and Google and the open web and everything. But to a degree, it's possible.
You'll need to unlock your phone.
Really?
She was pretty engaged by that, I think.
Okay, Google, tell me.
That's a first.
I'm switching to iPhone.
Privacy is more important.
Yeah, my privacy is more important than that. Watch, this thing will be bricked when I walk out of here.
Okay, it's back to point.
But yeah, but now that we can tell what advertising is working, I think that marketers are still stuck on the cost component. And Sorel talked about the cost component still being very important. And I will tell you that with the marketers that we've worked with, cost becomes much less important, at least the cost of service, us being a Butler layer company. The cost of service becomes much less important when the results are very clear.
Okay.
I think it's also a general issue when you look at where the issues we're sort of highlighting are seen as there's a cost to delivering hygiene for whether I'm buying media or whether I'm selling media. And I think as an industry, we've sort of ended up there simply because we've made so many mistakes throughout the years. And I think the challenge that we all have as players in the industry is rather to ask the question of how much will it cost or how can I reduce that cost, is what value can we drive? How do we leverage the data to drive performance on one side, right? And I think that the challenge we have as we come into the end of this year and into next year, as GDPR and as a lot of the privacy conversations become much more prevalent, as more people start to come sort of fall foul of those, is when you do have those signals, when you do have that clarity, and you're working with organizations that give you that visibility at a broad layer and at a sort of granularity that sort of makes it useful, is how do you convert that hygiene to value? And that trade is going to be, I think, extremely important for next year.
Well, there's hygiene, and then there's just outright ad fraud, right? And I think there are a lot of people who are saying, you know, I want zero ad fraud, and I'm like, well, what's wrong with 2% ad fraud if it's going to cost you 4% of your budget to get it down to zero? Wouldn't you rather have 2 and not pay anything for it? I mean, again, that's a very, very simplistic example, but I think that people are in pursuit of perfection, often at a negative return.
Sure. Will, you thought you were about to chime in there?
Well, yeah,
you were gonna say
we were
you're-
talking backstage, weren't we, about the 2 or the 3, and obviously all efforts to make the transactional part of this industry clearer and more transparent are to be applauded. I think that it's very important to step out the bubble a little bit. You know, I'm reading the news and everyone's talking about the Westminster bubble and then what people think. I think for AdTech, we talk very diligently about these kinds of process-driven things that we need to do in valuing media. When the guy from the ICO sits here and talks about his concerns with transparency, he is not talking about viewability rates or whether or not the ad was, you know, whether or not he thought the quality of the ad was this or whatever else. He's talking about, as a user, as a consumer of everything that we do, how does my dad, Joe on the street, whoever it might be, understand how these things are happening to him? How is the process of our industry impacting normal people, right? Mm-hmm. And that's an enormous transparency challenge for us, away and beyond from this type of transparency that we've actually put some effort into addressing. And I think the challenges that we're going to face in the coming 2 or 3 years, when the ICO starts looking at enforcement, when publishers are going to turn around and say, hey, who dropped this cookie? Who tracked this user? And we go, came from a wrapper of a wrapper of a wrapper through a pass back in an exchange, and I've got 3 SSP contracts in the drawer, let me go, it wasn't them, right? How are we going to address those kinds of transparency challenges? And they're very much have some real world connotations to them outside of the CPMs, the mechanics of transaction that's happening in the engine room already.
But I think that's a consequence of the first part, right? So where we see the problem has now moved to understanding where the impact on the user is. The reality is that's come as a result of inaction on the first part, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the problem as an industry we tend to have is, I mean, the question is, you know, are we doing enough? If we do the bare minimum, if we check that box and that's all we're doing, then we're going to end up in a scenario where we will be scrutinized and we'll be sort of held accountable by people who probably don't really understand this as well.
Do you guys actually think people care? Wait,
No,
right? Like,
Rhetorical, okay.
most don't. I'm gonna
right?
answer
Like
it,
we're
though.
making this huge deal
No, some senators and
Right.
MPs care.
because they don't understand, because it didn't exist earlier, and we're making this whole big deal for a very small portion of the population.
No, we have to regulate this, but by the way, can we put some facial recognition into the airport? I mean,
Exactly.
there you go.
Okay, well, I think actually,
Solved. Sorted.
actually earlier on during the ICO session, I think Rachel might be able to correct me if I've got the exact numbers wrong, but the ICO said they conducted a panel of 2,000 normal people, as we said, and
Between
I
the
think,
ages of,
he didn't quite say that, but
And how was it worded?
I think it was 63% said they were fine with targeted advertising, but I think when they went through the whole RTB protocols, that number halved when they actually explained it further. I believe that was the general gist of what he said. So that's just a little bit of a
The number
answer
of
to you.
the number of consumers that are okay with how food prep happens gets halved when they understand the actual process.
All right.
The sausage factory scenario is like that
yeah.
one.
Okay, so sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't have an emotional response to that, but what I would say is in 6 months' time, apparently the tide's coming in, right? So if the defence is, it's a cookie, I'm not sure how far you're going to get with that, right? And
Politically, nowhere.
and maybe if right now the users don't care, I'm sure that publishers care, right? If you're going to get a knock on the door because you're not able to understand what's happening on your pages and who's responsible for those things via the third parties that you deal with, then like the user understanding the process is one thing, but the ICO is going to be like, hey, I need you guys to behave better. I need you to I need for everybody upstream, not you. Sorry, your behaviour is awesome. I mean, for everybody, for us, everybody in this room, to start to understand that's a two-way street, right? You know, we fuss about how the transaction comes down to the page. We also need to be responsible and accountable for how that behaviour goes back up.
1,000%. If they would, stop retargeting me for shoes I already bought, that would be awesome. Yeah, but like, I don't think we all have a responsibility, and we should all act in the best. We should all act in the best way for the community at large, and that's sort of what I think Ronan was getting at before when I said that what happened is that supply became completely commoditized, and so therefore, there were various techniques, right? Google did it. Almost everybody did it, right? There were buy-side fees. There was, bid caching done in a way that didn't follow the rules. There was ad fraud and bot fraud, and there's so much, right? There's nobody who's totally innocent in this, so it's...
No, but there's credit card fraud, and yet we all still use credit cards, and the credit card industry is like it's at a controlled, acceptable level. Obviously, they'd like it to be lower, but I think perfect is the enemy of good, and I think that this industry has really just shot itself in the foot as many times as it possibly could by trying to pursue perfection as opposed to very good.
Okay, well, not to have everything negative, do you find that advertisers are fostering more direct relationship with publishers, such as yourself, to really sort of close out the loop and, just bring a torch onto that black box a little bit more, if that's ever possible?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have relationships that are much deeper with advertisers now because we are willing to share whatever information we have. That's how come Jay and I are such good friends, and various other people here, is because I've got nothing to hide. And if you don't know, I don't know what's happening on your side, and you don't know what's happening on my side. Let's talk about how it works on both sides so that everybody understands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how many advertisers out there or agencies, rather than calling this person, the SSP, the verification provider, the DSP, et cetera, how many people pick up the phone and call the publisher and just say, I just spent $5, how much got through? Not many. No, and that is the way to do it.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, then, how does the agency remuneration model fit into that? If you've got advertisers making more direct relationships with people like Jana, how does the agency model fit into it?
I think what Sorrell said this morning, which is, agencies typically have this paranoia that that publishers or tech providers are going to contact their clients, and we're totally fine. I mean, you're paying us typically, so we're happy to do it. But I think that the service layer model comes from, number one, being at the forefront of the industry and having forged paths that the advertiser couldn't forge alone. That may be technologically, that may be from a financial model in terms of how it pays and works with publishers or tech systems. And so I think that marketers have to just relook at what they want in terms of value out of their relationship. Usually what we say if we're working with an automotive manufacturer is like, well, how many cars do you want to sell? Forget how much you want to spend in media. How many cars do you want to sell? And let's actually look at your model, and let's back it into how much you're probably going to have to spend. I mean, an agency should say to a marketer, we want to spend the least amount of money on your behalf to achieve your goals. But I think so many agencies get a budget of 10 million bucks, and they're like, all right, how do we spend 10 million bucks?
As
That's not
cheaply
good.
as possible. But, you know,
Right, at
my
as low
favorite
of a
saying is
CPM.
cheap is expensive, as we found out.
Correct.
I think
And
this is
absolutely.
Sure. I think this is the challenge, right? Where we are today, a lot of the agencies are probably going to end up in a world where execution is going to be their business model.
It's pretty commoditized.
And I think the challenge we have and challenge they have is, how do they elevate the conversation to being far more about strategy, far more about, let's talk about business goals, let's talk about business value, and how we then translate that into an execution of strategy of some form or another. And I think that's the area that as an industry we need to either, as a tech player, we need to help empower those agencies to be able to go have those conversations. There's got to be some responsibility on the agencies to want to have those conversations and recognize that there's going to be a need for change to be able to do those.
Sure. Okay. We're coming to very close to the end of our time here. But one of the things I guess would be interested to hear a little bit more about is if there's any advertisers or even people from the ICO or other data protection watchdogs in the EU area here, how would you recommend that we move towards a model of greater transparency? What has to happen from, say, the advertiser end, or even, probably primarily for the advertisers, how the money is spent? Will, do you want to kick us off?
What do we do to manage for regulation going forward?
Just how do we make things?
2 minutes and 45 seconds.
You're wasting-
Okay. So from our point of view, it is about clarity of understanding who you do business with.
Yeah.
In our organisation, we talk about vendor management, digital vendor risk management. Like, who are the people that are connected to me? What are they responsible for doing? And that covers everything. We talk, what is this cookie? Who owns it? Which company dropped it? How long does it persist? What is the intention of it?
Okay.
Are those things transparent to you? Do you understand those things? Because as a publisher, it's your obligation. And if you're covered then as a supply partner, then it becomes your obligation. That goes all the way right up to the point of to the point of transaction. So how does transparency for the topic today represent itself in your ability as a player in this market to understand what you're accountable for, what your partners are accountable for, what their policies are as they relate to that accountability, and then how to run your business through that. And that is really not easy to do. Right?
Okay.
People have to employ people like us, people like other organisations to do that work. That would seem to be an expensive point of entry to be compliant over the next 10 years.
Okay.
Good for us, but hey, I think we're all going to have to do it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
John, if huge advertiser was here, how would you recommend that they move to build up better transparency and trust within the industry? What generally are you not seeing that would be quite an easy problem to solve for them?
Standards.
Yeah.
I mean, if we could all agree on how we're going to collect identity, make it so that we're not trying to do cookie matches 100 different times on a publisher's page, how we're going to, how the auction works. Is it really unified? And do the advertisers, and does everybody know who's taking a CPM out of the buy? Right? And really understanding that, right? And you go into a platform and you start checking boxes. Yes, I want the media trust. Yes, I want double verify. Yes, I want this technology. Yeah, right? There's a CPM associated with everyone, and that is something that what I see anyway when we talk to people as they are building direct relationships with us, we say, well, can you turn that on after the fact? To verify, that's fine. We have no issues. You need all of these technologies, but understand if you want to know that $1 in is $1 out, you can't put all of that stuff on.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the marketers, who lament the ad tech tax, but then require that 6 different players along the way get their 2 pennies, is a little bit tough. I think in terms of how we do this, I think for marketers, they need to find an agency or a service layer partner that they can actually trust, as opposed to and set up a contract that just allows full transparency and flexibility. I think for what we're buying and to know what we're buying, I think that's got a ways to go. And for the consumer, I think to your point, like, you know, usually you don't need regulation or laws unless someone messes it up, right? There was no law that said do not steal before there was the first thief. You know, but then we were like, oh, well, this isn't good. We probably should make that law. And so, so there's been enough people that have abused it. And yeah, now we need some standards and we need some regulation.
Okay, Tazil, do you want to close this out?
Yeah, so you know, I think we've heard a lot from the panel and from earlier discussions. I think the key issue is, as an industry, we need to take that responsibility. And I think fundamentally, something that I'm going to be going out quite regularly to market and saying is challenging the status quo. Right? We can't accept that what we're doing today is the best that we can do. And so marketers need to be challenging their agencies to say, what can you do more for me? I mean, cost aside, it's about what are we doing enough to protect our brands and build transparency and trust. Even agencies need to ask their tech partners and within their own organizations whether they're doing enough. And the same thing with publishers. I think publishers need to recognize that, I mean, not all impressions are born equal, right? How do we get to that level of understanding that when we have good impressions that are brand safe, viewable, fraud-free, and NGO, that they're valued properly? So that responsibility sits with us as an industry, and I think everybody in this room has an element of that responsibility.
Okay, please.
Okay.
Last
but
word. Yeah.
The reality is, though, that advertisers, right, believe that programmatic equals cheap. And that is something that the industry, we've all done this to ourselves. And so you can't tell somebody that they need to learn the value of the industry at the same time as telling them, oh, but programmatic's cheap. It's not.
Okay,
Great.
well, I think on that note, boom. Thank you very much, everybody. Can we have a big round of applause for our panelists?